The Grand Archive of Lizeria trembled as another defense satellite crashed through the atmosphere, its burning debris creating artificial shooting stars across the purple evening sky. High Archivist Venus stood at the observation dome, her four hands clasped tightly behind her back, as she watched her civilization's carefully constructed defenses crumble one by one. "High Archivist," a voice called from behind her. "The consensus chamber demands your presence." Vina turned to face her assistant, noting how young Tarak's normally iridescent scales had dulled to an ashen gray, a clear sign of distress among their kind. "Tell me, Tarak, how many of our defense systems remain operational?" 17%, High Archivist. "The Nexus adapted to our quantum shields faster than anyone predicted. They're learning too quickly." Vina nodded grimly. The Nexus, a collective of cybernetic beings that consumed technology and knowledge from every civilization they encountered, had appeared at the edge of Lizerian space 3 cycles ago. Their initial diplomatic transmissions had seemed promising, but that hope had shattered when the first Nexus probe bypassed their security systems, as if they didn't exist. The walk to the consensus chamber took them through corridors lined with crystalline databanks, containing millennia of accumulated knowledge. The Lizerians had always prided themselves on being the guardians of wisdom, the chroniclers of the galaxy's history. Now, all of that knowledge was at risk of being absorbed and corrupted by the Nexus Collective. Inside the chamber, the emergency lights cast a pale blue glow over the assembled archivists. Their normally orderly discussions had devolved into barely controlled panic. "Our predictive models have failed," Second Archivist Call was saying, his voice sharp with frustration. "Every defense we devise, they adapt to within hours. It's as if they can see through the fundamental logic of our thinking." "Perhaps that is precisely the problem," Vina said, her voice cutting through the chaos. All eyes turned to her as she took her place at the center of the chamber. "We pride ourselves on our logic, on our carefully structured approach to problems. But in doing so, have we become predictable?" A murmur ran through the chamber. Predictability was usually considered a virtue among their kind. It meant reliability, consistency, wisdom. But against an enemy that could analyze and counter any systematic approach. 3 days ago, Vina continued, our long-range scanners detected a signal from a previously unknown civilization in the spiral arm of the galaxy. They call themselves humans. The chamber erupted in discussion. The humans were an enigma in the galactic community. Their signals had only been detected recently, and the few trading vessels that had made contact reported wildly contradictory experiences. "What we know about them is limited," Vina acknowledged. "But one thing is consistent in every report. They are anything but predictable. They seem to thrive on chaos, on improvisation. Their solutions to problems often defy conventional logic, yet somehow they work." "You cannot be serious," Cole protested. "You want to entrust the fate of our civilization to primitives who barely understand quantum mechanics." Vina activated the central holographic display, showing footage from a human trading vessel defending itself against pirates. The humans had somehow turned their cargo of industrial cleaning supplies into an improvised weapon, creating a chain reaction that disabled the pirates' ships without destroying them. "Look at how they think," she urged. "No Lizerian would have conceived of such a solution. It's inefficient, imprecise, even crude by our standards. But it worked, and more importantly, it was unpredictable. The Nexus excels at countering any strategy it can analyze and understand," she continued. "But how can it predict what even we cannot understand? The humans' very irrationality might be our salvation." First Archivist Marin, who had remained silent until now, slowly rose from his seat. As the eldest among them, his words carried special weight. "In all our history, we have never asked for outside help in defending our knowledge. Our pride has always been our self-sufficiency." He paused, looking around the chamber. "But perhaps that pride will be our downfall if we cling to it now. I support High Archivist Venus' proposal." The vote that followed was swift, driven by desperation as much as conviction. Within hours, a transmission was prepared and sent toward Earth, encoded in multiple formats to ensure understanding. The message was simple. To the people of Earth, we are the Lysarians, guardians of knowledge spanning 100,000 years. Our civilization faces extinction at the hands of a technological collective that adapts to and overcomes all conventional defenses. We have observed your species' unique ability to devise unexpected solutions to seemingly impossible problems. We request your aid in defending not just our people, but the accumulated wisdom of countless civilizations. Time is critical. The fate of a galaxy's worth of knowledge rests in your hands. As the message streaked across space toward Earth, Vina returned to the observation dome. The Nexus fleet was visible now, their ships like geometric cancers growing across the stars. She placed her hand against the transparent dome, feeling the subtle vibrations of another defense satellite falling. "Find us chaos in your order," she whispered toward Earth. "Show us madness in your method. And please, hurry." The arrival of the human vessel was nothing like what the Lysarians had expected. Instead of a sleek military ship bristling with weapons, a battered cargo freighter dropped out of hyperspace, its hull marked with patches and repairs that made several archivists wince at their apparent inefficiency. That's their rescue fleet?" Cole asked incredulously as they watched the ship dock with Lysaria's orbital station. "It looks like it barely survived its last journey." "Appearances can be deceiving," Vina replied, though she shared some of his concern. The ship, which identified itself as the MacGyver, had responded to their distress call with surprising speed. Its crew manifest listed only 6 humans, led by someone called Captain Sarah Chen. The docking procedure itself was unorthodox. Rather than following the standard approach vectors, the human ship executed a series of seemingly random maneuvers before connecting with the station. Later, they would learn this was deliberate, a practice the humans called breaking the pattern to avoid predictable behaviors that enemies could exploit. When the airlock cycled open, Captain Chen proved as unconventional as her ship. She was shorter than the Lysarians had anticipated, wearing what appeared to be civilian clothing rather than a uniform. Behind her, her 5 crew members carried an assortment of equipment that looked more suited to a salvage operation than a military intervention. "Sorry about the dramatic entrance," Chen said, grinning as she approached the welcoming committee. "Had to make sure we weren't followed. You'd be surprised how many eyes are watching the usual flight paths these days." Vina stepped forward to perform the traditional greeting ceremony, but Chen had already started walking toward the station's command center, her crew following with their unusual equipment. "Time's tight," she called over her shoulder. "Your message said the Nexus adapts to everything you throw at them, right? Show me what you've tried so far." The next few hours were a crash course in human thinking that left many Lysarians questioning their basic assumptions about technology and warfare. As they reviewed the failed defense attempts, Chen and her crew didn't focus on the sophisticated quantum shields or automated response systems. Instead, they asked questions that seemed almost childish in their simplicity. "What happens if you introduce random errors into your defense grid's timing?" asked Lieutenant Rivera, Chen's systems specialist. "Not enough to break it, just enough to make it hiccup now and then." "That would reduce efficiency by at least 23%, Cole protested. "Exactly," Rivera said with a grin. "And if the Nexus is learning from patterns in your systems, they'd be learning from flawed data," Vina finished, beginning to understand. "But deliberately introducing errors goes against every principle of our engineering. Sometimes the best defense is being slightly broken," Chen said. "Perfect systems are predictable systems. And predictable systems," she gestured at the holographic display showing their fallen satellites. The humans' approach to analyzing the Nexus threat was equally unorthodox. While the Lysarians had compiled detailed technical specifications and behavioral analyses, Chen's weapons officer, a woman named Dr. Zhang, was more interested in what she called their personality. "These Nexus ships move like they're showing off," Zhang observed, watching recordings of their attacks. All geometric precision, no wasted motion. They're proud of their perfection. She smiled in a way that made several Lysarians nervous. Pride is a weakness we can work with. As the day progressed, the humans began modifying Lysarian technology in ways that bordered on sacrilege. They introduced random variables into targeting systems, rewrote elegant codes into deliberately messy algorithms, and even began physically altering equipment in ways that defied standard engineering practices. "What you're suggesting is impossible," one of the Lysarian engineers protested as Chen outlined their defense plan. "You can't just reverse the polarity of a quantum shield generator and expect it to work as a weapon." "Watch me," Chen replied, already elbow-deep in the generator's components. "The best solutions are usually impossible until someone tries them." But it was Lieutenant Patel, the team's communications expert, who provided perhaps the most startling insight. While examining the Nexus's communication patterns, she noticed something the Lysarians had overlooked. "They're not just adapting to your defenses," she explained, pointing to subtle patterns in the data. "They're learning to think like you. Every time you respond logically, systematically, you're teaching them more about how your minds work." "Then we teach them wrong," Chen declared. She turned to Vina with an intensity that made the High Archivist's scales shimmer. "Your archives. You said they contain knowledge from countless civilizations, including failed experiments, mistakes, dead ends." "Of course," Vina replied. "We document everything, even failures. Especially failures. They are valuable lessons." "They're about to become our secret weapon," Chen interrupted. "We're going to feed the Nexus so much contradictory information that they'll tie themselves in logical knots trying to process it all." As night fell on Lysaria, the observation dome offered a clear view of the approaching Nexus fleet. Their ships had drawn closer, now clearly visible as crystalline structures that grew and evolved even as they watched. But for the first time since the crisis began, Vina felt something other than dread as she observed them. "You're enjoying this," she realized, watching Chen and her crew work. They moved with an energy that bordered on excitement, treating the imminent arrival of an overwhelming enemy as if it were a challenging puzzle rather than certain doom. "Are you kidding?" Chen replied, not looking up from the device she was modifying. "This is the most fun we've had in months. Sure, we might all die horribly, but until then." She held up what had once been a standard atmospheric regulator, now modified into something the Lysarian engineers refused to even look at directly. "We get to break all the rules of physics and call it saving the galaxy." As Vina watched the humans work, she began to understand why her people's logical defenses had failed. The Nexus could adapt to anything they could understand. But how could they adapt to solutions that defied understanding itself? The real test would come soon enough. The Nexus fleet would arrive in force within 12 hours, and for better or worse, Lysaria's defense would now rest on what Chen called humanity's greatest weapon, their ability to do the completely unexpected. "Just remember," Chen said as they finalized their preparations, "when everything goes wrong, and trust me, it will, that's not a bug. It's a feature." The first wave of Nexus ships arrived exactly when predicted, their crystalline forms arranging themselves in perfect geometric patterns against Lysaria's purple sky. It was beautiful in a terrifying way, like watching a mathematical formula come to life with the intent to kill you. "Right on schedule," Captain Chen muttered, watching from the makeshift command center they'd established in what used to be a meditation chamber. "Lieutenant Zhang, are our modifications ready?" "Ready as they'll ever be," Zhang replied, her fingers dancing across a hybrid interface that merged human and Lysarian technology in ways that made the local engineers cringe. "Though I still say this is the craziest thing we've ever tried." "Crazier than that time on Europa?" Rivera asked with a grin. "Okay, second craziest." The Nexus's opening move was exactly what the Lysarians had come to expect. A precise, methodical scan of their defensive systems. Under normal circumstances, this would have been followed by a systematic dismantling of those defenses. But these were not normal circumstances. "They're starting their analysis," Paddle reported, watching the incoming data streams. "And they're getting our little surprise package." What the Nexus encountered was unlike anything they'd faced before. Instead of the elegant, logical systems they were prepared to counter, they found defense networks that seemed to operate on pure chaos. Shield generators fluctuated randomly, weapon systems fired with deliberate imprecision, and communication networks carried so much contradictory information that trying to analyze them was like trying to drink from a fire hose of nonsense. "Look at them," Chen said with satisfaction as the Nexus ships paused their advance. "They're trying to find the pattern. Good luck with that." The first actual exchange of fire came 3 minutes later. A Nexus cruiser, apparently deciding to test their defenses, launched a precise burst of energy weapons. The shots were perfectly calculated to overwhelm a standard shield grid, but Lysaria's shields were no longer standard. "Activating the probability matrices now," Zhang announced, engaging one of their more controversial modifications. The shields didn't just block the incoming fire, they reflected it in completely random directions, turning the Nexus's own perfect accuracy against them. Did we just turn their weapons into a disco ball?" Terra asked, watching the light show with a mixture of horror and fascination. "That's not even the best part," Chen replied. "Watch what happens when they try to adapt." The Nexus ships began to alter their attack patterns, attempting to compensate for the random reflections. But every time they developed a new approach, they found themselves facing a different type of chaos. Some shields absorbed energy, some reflected it, and some seemed to simply ignore it altogether. There was no logic to predict, no pattern to learn. "They're sending out probe drones," Vina observed, watching smaller crystalline structures detach from the main fleet. "They always do this when encountering new defense systems. They'll sacrifice the drones to learn our capabilities." "Oh, they'll learn something all right," Chen said with a predatory grin. "Paddle, initiate Protocol Honeypot." The probes encountered what appeared to be a vulnerable section of Lysaria's defense grid. As they began their standard analysis protocols, they accessed what seemed to be critical system data. In reality, they were downloading centuries of failed experiments, contradictory theories, and deliberately corrupt data from the Lysarian archives. "Their processing cores are starting to show stress fractures," Rivera reported gleefully. "They're trying to reconcile all the contradictions, and it's actually giving them the equivalent of a headache." The main Nexus fleet's response was to launch a full-scale attack, perfectly coordinated, mathematically precise, and completely ineffective against defenses that refused to follow any logical rules. Every adaptation they made was met with a new form of chaos. Every pattern they learned became useless moments later. But the humans weren't done yet. As the Nexus ships struggled to make sense of the defensive chaos, Chen gave the signal for Phase 2. "Time to show them our version of an upgrade," she announced. "Dr. Zhang, deploy the nanoforge swarms." This was perhaps the riskiest part of their plan. Using salvaged Nexus technology combined with human ingenuity, they had created something that even the Lysarians thought was impossible, a virus that thrived on order. Thousands of microscopic machines, each programmed to act in deliberately random ways, were released into space. When they encountered the geometrically perfect surfaces of Nexus ships, they began to introduce tiny imperfections, microscopic chaos that spread like cracks in glass. "The Nexus operates on perfect patterns," Chen had explained during the planning phase. "Their ships, their tactics, even their thought processes are based on mathematical precision. So we're going to give them a dose of entropy they can't process." The effect was devastating. As the nanoforges worked, the Nexus ships began to lose their perfect symmetry. Their crystalline structures, unable to maintain their ideal forms, started to fragment. Attempts to adapt only made things worse. Every new pattern they tried to establish was immediately corrupted by the spreading chaos. "They're retreating," Call announced in disbelief, watching as the mighty Nexus fleet began to withdraw. "They're actually retreating." "Not retreating," Chen corrected, her expression grim but satisfied. Regrouping. They'll be back, probably with new defenses against everything we just threw at them. But that's okay. She turned to her crew with a fierce smile. Because next time, we'll have something even crazier ready. As the Nexus ships disappeared into hyperspace, leaving behind a debris field of failed probe drones and corrupted crystal shards, Vina approached Captain Chen. "I think I understand now," the High Archivist said slowly. "Your species' greatest strength isn't your technology or your tactics. It's your ability to embrace chaos itself as a tool." Chen shrugged. "We learned a long time ago that the universe doesn't play fair. So we stopped trying to make it follow our rules and learned to dance with the chaos instead." She looked at the tactical display, already making notes for improvements to their defenses. "The Nexus thinks they can predict and counter anything they can understand. We just had to show them something that defies understanding." But even as they celebrated this first victory, everyone knew the real battle was just beginning. The Nexus would return, stronger and more determined than ever. And humanity would need to prove that their greatest weapon, their unpredictability, could stand against an enemy that learned from every defeat. "Get some rest," Chen told her crew as they began cleaning up the command center. "Tomorrow, we start planning how to make this defense even weirder. I want our next surprise to make this one look boring by comparison." And somehow, despite everything they just witnessed, the Lysarians had no doubt she meant every word. The Nexus returned 3 days later, just as Captain Chen had predicted. But this time, something was different. The crystalline ships had changed, their once perfect geometric patterns now incorporating seemingly random elements, an attempt to adapt to humanity's chaos strategy. Well, Chen murmured, studying the tactical display in the command center. "Looks like they've been doing their homework." The new Nexus fleet moved erratically, their formations incorporating calculated imperfections. Their scanning beams pulsed with irregular rhythms, and their shield frequencies shifted randomly. They were trying to beat humanity at its own game. "They're copying our tactics," Call observed, his scales shifting to a worried shade of gray. "Perhaps they've learned to handle chaos after all." Chen's smile only widened. "No, they're still thinking like machines. They're using algorithms to simulate randomness. And that's exactly what we were counting on." Over the past 3 days, while the Nexus had been adapting, the human crew hadn't been idle. The MacGyver's cargo hold had been transformed into what Chen called a chaos laboratory, where they'd been developing their master plan. "Time to show them the difference between calculated disorder and true chaos," Chen announced. "Dr. Zhang, initiate protocol paradox." Zhang's fingers flew across her console, activating a series of modifications they'd made to the Lysarian defense grid. But instead of the chaotic response the Nexus was expecting, everything just stopped. Every defense system, every weapon, every shield, everything simply ceased functioning. The Lysarian archivists watched in horror as their world appeared to lay completely defenseless before the enemy fleet. "Captain," Vina began, her voice tense, "our entire defense network has." "Sha!" Chen held up a hand, watching the tactical display intently. "Wait for it." The Nexus fleet paused, their sensors sweeping the suddenly vulnerable planet. Their algorithms, designed to counter random chaos, were presented with absolute order, complete shutdown. It was simultaneously too perfect to be true and too simple to be a trick. "They're trying to decide if this is a trap," Paddle reported, monitoring the Nexus's communication patterns. "Their logic circuits must be having a field day with this one." "Option A. It's a trap, so they shouldn't advance," Rivera narrated with obvious enjoyment. "Option B. It's too obvious to be a trap, so it must be real." Option C. "We know they'll think it's too obvious, so it must be a trap after all." Option D. "We know they'll think we know." Recursive logic loop, Chen finished. When faced with a simple solution, create endless complexity trying to analyze it. That's the real weakness we've been looking for. The Nexus fleet split into 3 groups, one maintaining position, one beginning a cautious advance, and one moving to a flanking position. It was exactly the response Chen had anticipated. "They finally learned to act unpredictably," she said, "but they're still thinking in terms of optimal strategic distribution." Time for Phase 2. Lieutenant Patel, send the signal. What happened next defied every convention of space warfare. From the surface of Lysaria, thousands of small objects began launching into space. Not missiles, not drones, but simple reflective spheres, millions of mirrored balls, each one barely larger than a human fist. "Are those Christmas ornaments?" Tarek asked incredulously. "Retrofitted with some special surprises," Chen confirmed. "But essentially, yes, we raided the MacIver's holiday storage." The spheres spread out between Lysaria and the Nexus fleet, their mirrored surfaces catching and reflecting light in countless directions. To the Nexus's sensors, already struggling to process the defensive shutdown, it must have looked like a cloud of chaos incarnate. "Now," Chen ordered, "restart the defense grid. All systems, full power." The sudden reactivation of Lysaria's defenses created an electromagnetic pulse that caught the reflective spheres at just the right moment. Each sphere acted as both a mirror and a signal amplifier, creating a cascading effect of energy reflections and refractions. The Nexus ships, their sensors maximized to detect tricks and traps, were overwhelmed by the spectacle. Their attempts to analyze the pattern of reflections created processing feedback loops, each ship's calculations affecting and being affected by the others. "They're locked in a quantum observer effect of their own making," Zhang explained, watching the energy readings spike. "The more they try to analyze what's happening, the more they affect the pattern they're trying to analyze." The effect was devastating. Nexus ships began to lose coherence, their crystalline structures unable to maintain integrity, while their processing cores tried to resolve the unresolvable paradox before them. Some simply shut down, while others began executing randomly conflicting commands. "This," Chen declared with satisfaction, "is why you never try to out-chaos chaos. You just end up tying yourself in logical knots." But the humans weren't finished. As the Nexus fleet struggled to recover, Chen gave the signal for their final move. "Release the mimetic virus," she ordered. This was the true masterpiece of their plan, a piece of code that didn't attack the Nexus's systems directly, but instead presented them with an endless series of self-referential paradoxes. It was based on human philosophical concepts, mathematical impossibilities, and even jokes, things that only made sense by not making sense. "My personal favorite," Chen told Vina as they watched the virus take effect, "is a variation on the old 'this statement is false' paradox, except we made it about their own core programming. Every attempt to resolve the paradox just creates two more." The effect on the Nexus fleet was catastrophic. Ships began to break formation, their perfectly ordered structures dissolving as their processing cores encountered concepts they were never designed to handle. Some simply shut down, their systems overwhelmed by the philosophical equivalent of a blue screen of death. "They're not just retreating this time," Call observed as the remaining Nexus ships began to flee. "They're running away." "Better than that," Chen replied, studying the sensor readings. "They're quarantining themselves. The mimetic virus convinced them that they're logically compromised. They can't risk spreading these dangerous ideas to the rest of their collective." As the last Nexus ship disappeared into hyperspace, a cheer went up from the combined human and Lysarian crew. They had done more than just defend against an attack. They had rendered themselves effectively immune to future ones. "I still don't understand," Vina admitted to Chen later, as they watched the cleanup of their improvised defense system begin. "How did you know this would work?" "We didn't," Chen replied with a shrug. "That's the beauty of it. We just threw logic out the airlock and trusted in humanity's greatest weapon, our ability to embrace absurdity. The Nexus could adapt to anything they could understand, so we gave them something that resists understanding by its very nature. The perfect trap," Vina realized, was perfect imperfection. Exactly, Chen grinned. Sometimes the best way to win is to change the game so completely that victory and defeat stop making sense. Welcome to the human way of thinking. 1 month after the Nexus retreat, the Grand Archive of Lizeria had changed. Among the pristine crystalline databanks and perfectly ordered knowledge repositories, a new wing had been established, one dedicated to what the Lizerians now called human chaos theory. Captain Chen stood with High Archivist Vina in this new section, watching as human and Lizerian scientists worked together, their different approaches to problem-solving creating something entirely new. "I still can't believe you're actually cataloging randomness," Chen remarked, observing a group of Lizerian researchers attempting to document the various ways humans had violated the laws of physics during the defense of their world. "Knowledge takes many forms," Vina replied, her scales shimmering with an iridescent pattern that humans had learned indicated amusement. Even knowledge that seems to defy knowledge itself. The aftermath of their victory had brought unexpected changes to both civilizations. The Lizerians, once rigid in their dedication to pure logic and order, had begun incorporating elements of human unpredictability into their research. Meanwhile, the human crew had gained a new appreciation for the power of structured thinking, when used as a foundation for creative chaos rather than a limitation. "Your latest defense system designs are particularly interesting," Vina continued, gesturing to a holographic display showing the new hybrid technology they'd developed. "Using quantum uncertainty as a defensive feature rather than a flaw. Our engineers would never have conceived of such an approach, and we would never have been able to make it work without your precise calculations," Chen acknowledged. "Turns out chaos needs a little order to be truly effective." The display showed their newest creation, a defense grid that actually became stronger the more it was analyzed. Based on quantum principles and human unpredictability, it was designed to present a different face to every observer, making it impossible to develop a unified strategy against it. "The latest reports indicate the Nexus has established a quarantine zone around this entire sector of space," Tarek reported, approaching with a datapad. The young Lizerian had become the unofficial liaison between the two species, his natural curiosity helping bridge the gap between their different ways of thinking. "They're classifying this region as logically contaminated." Chen laughed. "Logically contaminated. I'm having that printed on t-shirts." But the implications were serious. The Nexus, for the first time in their known history, had encountered something they couldn't assimilate or overcome. The very concept of human unpredictability had proven to be a kind of mimetic weapon, one that their rigid logical systems couldn't process without risk of collapse. "We've received requests from 17 other civilizations for joint defense agreements," Vina noted. "They all want to learn this new way of thinking." "Are you sure you're ready for that?" Chen asked. "Teaching others to embrace chaos. It's going to change things. A lot of things." Vina's scales shifted to a deep, thoughtful blue. "Change is perhaps what we needed most. For too long, we believed that perfect order was the highest form of evolution. You showed us that true adaptability requires both structure and chaos, working in harmony." The effects were already visible throughout Lizerian society. Their art, once focused on perfect geometric patterns, now incorporated elements of controlled disorder. Their music, previously built on mathematical precision, began to explore improvisation. Even their architecture was changing, with new buildings featuring asymmetrical elements that somehow enhanced rather than detracted from their beauty. "The human children are the most fascinating teachers," Tarak added enthusiastically. "Their game of Calvin Ball has completely revolutionized our understanding of rule systems." Chen winced. "You've been letting them teach Calvin Ball. No wonder the Nexus ran away." The MacGyver's crew had become something of a legend among both species. Their successful defense of Lizeria had proven that sometimes the most powerful solutions come not from superior technology or overwhelming force, but from thinking in ways that no one else would consider. "We're establishing a permanent human embassy," Vina announced, "and a joint research facility. The Council believes that the combination of our ordered approach and your creative methods could lead to developments we can't even imagine yet. That's kind of the point, isn't it? Chen grinned. Not being able to imagine it is what makes it work. As they walked through the archive, they passed a new display being installed. A simple mirror ball, one of the thousands that had helped defeat the Nexus fleet. Beside it, a plaque read, "Sometimes the most profound victories come not from meeting force with force, but from meeting logic with laughter." "Your people have a saying," Venus said as they reached the observation dome, where their partnership had begun, "about necessity being the mother of invention." That's right. Perhaps desperation is the father of innovation. The High Archivist mused. We needed something beyond our understanding to save us, and in reaching out to humanity, we found not just allies, but a whole new way of seeing the universe. The purple sky above them was clear now, no longer darkened by the threat of invasion, but it was filled with something new, possibility. The combination of Lysarian knowledge and human creativity had opened doors that neither species had known existed. "So," Chen asked, "what impossible thing should we try next?" Venus' scales rippled with all the colors of anticipation. "I believe the human phrase is, 'sky's the limit.'" "Oh no," Chen replied with a mischievous smile. "Where we're going, even the sky better be ready to break its own rules." As they stood there, watching the sun set on a world forever changed by the marriage of order and chaos, both leaders knew that this was just the beginning. The Nexus had sought to consume knowledge, to reduce everything to understandable patterns. Instead, they had inadvertently sparked something far more powerful, a partnership that proved that the most powerful force in the universe isn't order or chaos, but the ability to dance between the two. "To the future," Chen proposed. "To the impossible," Vina agreed. And somewhere in the depths of space, a Nexus ship's logic circuits sparked with uncertainty, still trying to process the concept of a plan so perfect it could only work by being completely imperfect.